Hello, everyone, and welcome to Art of the Week with Katya, episode 18. This week, we've had various holidays that have been coming up during this winter season. We'll be having the winter solstice very soon, and this week we also have the Christian holiday of Christmas. There are also other holidays as well in the States and internationally that are happening during this time. Since I am in Italy, I thought that for this episode we would look a little bit at Madonna and Child. This is based on a church that I saw actually in Sicily several months ago, almost a year ago. And there were these two paintings that you see right here side by side, and they're very bizarre that they would be seen as panels practically next to each other in the same church. And I want to explain to you why. Also, different from my past episodes, I'm going to do this episode as an image essay, very much like in Ways of Seeing by John Berger, the way that he sometimes has in his book, where the images kind of do some of the talking. But we're going to do a little bit of traditional art history. So let's start with the Madonna and Child type. This is which we see on the left side right now. This is very much an Italian type of painting. It comes from the Florentine Renaissance, but it's also, to be honest, it probably comes from Byzantium. I've been thinking about it, reflecting on it as I've been looking at these images. But this is the general main narrative of art history. Here we go. Okay, so with gigantic altarpieces like this, becoming more and more in tradition anyway, over time, we have Giotto, who is credited by Vasari, who is considered the first art historian. He is credited with some of the first. Giotto, the artist, is considered one of the first artists, one of the founders of the Florentine Renaissance. And we see here in this image, we see a lot of the halos, the gold. This is tempera, which is a egg-based paint. And it was important because it dried very quickly, which is important because there isn't just paint on this altarpiece, first of all. And second of all, this altarpiece is gigantic. It's huge. As you can see, right, 325 centimeters tall. That's over 3 meters tall. Anyway, and we see here the gold of the halos as well. We see a certain amount of depth, but very much Mary is an extension of the throne, right? And she is holding the Christ child, who is kind of the center of this image, even though he is not centrally put exactly. We see the disc-like halo being featured here as well. Now we have this Madonna and Child by Giovanni Bellini. Giovanni Bellini is a Venetian Renaissance artist, early Renaissance. So now we're in the late 15th century, 1400s. And we can see, first of all, this painting is a bit smaller and it's done with oil. This is important and it will come up later. It's a very different technique. It's a very different material that was used to paint with, and it comes to Italy at a specific time for a specific reason. You can note also the intense colors that are revealed in this painting, and that this painting is about a third of the size of Giotto's painting. The intense colors and the intensity of the imagery was characteristic of Venice. In fact, that was one of the things that many artists who came to Venice during the Venetian Renaissance were asked to pick up in their artistic career. Next we have Raffaello. Okay, so now we're in the High Renaissance, the early 16th century, 1506. And in this case, this is again another Madonna and Child. We can see here, right? So we saw with Bellini, I forgot to mention this, the halo is completely different than what we saw with Giotto, right? With Giotto, we have this disc halo. With Bellini, you can barely see it. It's just this line right here, very, very delicate. Here, the halo is basically gone, and this is to do with humanism, right? The incredible humanistic aspects of Mary. Nonetheless, we notice that she is still seated, she is still in the center of the painting, and she is still acting basically as a backdrop and throne for Christ, who is between her legs, and St. John, who is very near Christ. And so even though we have all of this stuff with humanism and all of these changes, and you actually, through these images, you can kind of see the changes that happened in Italy during the Renaissance, during the period of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And we can even take it further here to Ludovico Carracci, Bolognese, after the Renaissance painter. Again, we have a Madonna and Child, and again she is seated, and again the infant is on her lap. In this case, of course, we don't have halos. Again, we have light that is emitting from her. And also, we might note that her limbs, if we were to look at them very clearly, really make no sense. This is Mannerist painting, so the incredible emotion of the way that she's twisting her body, and she's looking at San Domenico, who is almost accessing her as an image, and this is what made me reflect on its potential roots in Byzantine imagery, which we've already seen. There's a special ways in which the Madonna holds the child and all of this stuff that comes from the icons, the Byzantine icons. In a way, this image is almost treated as that. But the incredible emotion that we see of Mary, the way that she's pulling Christ to her side, to the rosary, is so incredibly emotional that it's distortive to her body. There is so much foreshortening that it almost doesn't make sense. But again, we still have this Mary and Christ type, and we can see from all of these paintings that we've looked at, right, from Giotto in the beginning to Bellini, kind of in the middle of all of the various changes that are happening, especially during the 15th century, to Raffaello, the height of the Renaissance, to even Ludovico Carracci after the Renaissance. We can see that this form doesn't change. We still have, like we have here, Mary and the child. The Mary is seated. Even if she isn't frontally seated, she is still seated. Actually, even in Giotto, she isn't frontally seated. She's turned just a little bit. And we can see that in all of these interpretations. And this is very much an Italian symbol, an Italian tradition that has been carried through the Italian and Florentine Renaissance and the Venetian Renaissance, and it's seen right here in Sicily. My guess would be that this painting is definitely after the Renaissance. I would say it's likely a Baroque painting. It's after Ludovico Carracci. It's definitely not Mannerist because the proportion of the limbs is really quite perfected. But it could be a Renaissance piece. I'm not entirely sure. The church that it was located in had Baroque architecture. But what's interesting about the other piece is that the other piece, contrary to all of this, breaks entirely away from everything that I've told you. Traditional Florentine Renaissance art history. We go into something completely else. And that is the Northern Renaissance Nativity. And we can see here so this is Rogier van der Weyden triptych. So we can see in the center of the triptych here, we can see Mary, a very different kind of imagery, right? Mary is not the throne of Christ. In fact, Mary doesn't have anything to do exactly with Christ. So we have the stable, this construction here, which is very nicely created in perspective, which is very nice. We have all of these buildings back here, all of the landscape. We have the patrons who are immediately accessible to Mary. Mary is shown as her statue of a saint by being physically larger than all those who are around her. This is the language of Northern Renaissance art. This specific art form that was using oils. Why? If we look at the dimensions, for example, this is a triptych, right? But this triptych alone, the central panel, is the same size as the Bellini painting, a third of the size of Giotto's painting. It is much, much smaller. And the reason is precisely that. Oil gives the ability to create tiny, tiny, tiny details for very, very small works of art, which most of the Northern Renaissance artworks think of. This would be like, the measure of this would be the size of Giotto's altarpiece in the Northern Renaissance mind. This is something completely different. right? A society that is working in details, the details of this background here. I'm sure that if we zoomed in, we would see an entire city, an entire working city in incredible detail. And again, here we don't have the plate halo, we don't have the line halo either. We have kind of a star halo coming from Mary. This is in 1450. And we see that she has just given birth to Christ. This is a nativity, and she's praying down to him because Christ is so incredibly important in this narrative that even Mary isn't entirely allowed to participate. The thing is also about this type is that in the Northern Renaissance, as we can see, okay, Petrus Christus, same type of image, right? We have the structure here, then there's Mary, and again, she's praying to Christ who is on the ground. This image actually is incredibly important because of what we have here, the sandals, which I'm not going to get into now, but it shows you that this image, unlike the Madonna and Child images in Italy, this particular image of the Nativity, even though it happened, it definitely had its place in the mid and late 15th century in the Northern Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance underwent a lot of changes, especially in imagery, especially in what from the Bible was worshipped and when. And of course, the Northern Renaissance is in Bruges. So of course, as soon as the Renaissance is over, it will be over with the coming of Protestantism, the Reformation, which is extraordinary and changes all iconography and all ways of making art in this area after this point. But so here we have a very similar thing, but we can see that these images, they all kind of are clumped around the same time. They don't have the same incredibly spaced outness that the Italian form does because of these reasons. Now, and again, here we have Hans Memling, our latest one. Again, it's a nativity. And again, we have the same things, right? We have the structure here. We have Mary, and she's praying to the Christ child who is on the ground, even though she's just given birth to him. And we have the background, and we also have back here a potential narrative, right, of her maybe starting to give birth and then coming here and having the child. We also have the animals, and we have yeah, that's all in this image. But in the Northern Renaissance, different parts of the image became more important as symbols because they became parts of larger narratives. And what's interesting is if we go back to what I saw in Sicily, here we are again, right? We have the column. This column is decorated, so probably important column. We have the structure here, and we have Mary kneeling here, and she's praying to the Christ child who is on the ground. This is not an Italian image type. So what is it doing in Sicily? Well, I mean, there are various possibilities. As we can see, this image, obviously, it differs very much in style from these ones. And since that is the case, it is highly possible because some Northern Renaissance painters were hired in Spanish courts, and Sicily was ruled by Spain since a later part of the Middle Ages. So it is highly possible that a Spanish or a Spanish taught artist made this image and put it in this church. But it is really interesting that in the south of Italy, you would see a Northern Renaissance type of art. It's not something that we would necessarily think would be possible. We think of Sicily and southern Italy as having its own history that has to do mostly with the Mediterranean. We don't associate it with Bruges. And yet, here it is. It's really quite extraordinary from this perspective. I would also date this painting to much later than the paintings that surround it. But it definitely, as we can see, is citing these paintings from this image essay that I have created. The last thing that I want to leave you all with is a little bit after Christmas is Epiphany and Adoration here that I saw in Treviso. Now, there's a very interesting thing also about Northern Italy. Northern Italy also had a certain exposure to the Northern Renaissance as well. And this one is located in Treviso. And we can see it was painted in the 16th century. So it's a little bit just after the High Renaissance. And we can also tell by the form of the three magi. But so we see, for example, we see the north here with the structure, right? Again, we have the structure again, and we have Mary and the child isn't entirely on Mary's lap. No, she's not praying to the child, but it is not expected from what we saw from the Italian Madonna and Child type imagery that often is included in these types of images. But in this adoration, another thing that we have from the Northern Renaissance is this hill and the buildings behind there. The way that that's painted is very much reminiscent of Bruegel and other artists, other Northern Renaissance artists. Remember, I told you about oil, right? And the incredible amounts of detail that they would put into their background, which is actually considered bad form in the Italian Renaissance. And we see that incredible amount of detail also here. The colors, the lighting, the way that it's done, the way that the hill is going back up there, it's very reminiscent of the Northern Renaissance. Nonetheless, as we get further forward, we see yet again the Madonna and Child together a bit more like the Raffaello one, but it's still, she is presenting herself as the throne and the child is to the side, and it's very much of that form as well. So in this case, we get this really interesting mixture of the two styles, and this is something that I found was really interesting. In the north of Italy, even though Italy didn't go through the Reformation exactly, in the same way as, say, France did, where it was very clear either we will be Protestant or we will be Catholic. In Italy, it was always clear we will be Catholic. But this area, the Veneto region, the region of Emilia-Romagna even, which is almost central Italy, felt very much and very strongly from all of their German friends and French painterly friends. These people, they had a network. And they were very much affected by what was going on. And we know that even Michelangelo, working in Rome, was very much affected by what was going on. The difference is, instead of having the Catholic Church's reaction to this particular event, we have a little bit of a participation of both sides. And this is a very special perspective that we get in the north of Italy that you wouldn't necessarily expect. It wasn't as simple of we are Protestant or we are Catholic, we embrace this kind of painterly form, we do that kind of painterly form. It wasn't at all like that. It was more like maybe we should try this kind of painterly form, and maybe we can dabble in this kind of painterly form, and maybe we can add our perspective in a similar kind of painterly form, and maybe then we can go back to this other painterly form, but we have to redo it in a different way. It's really quite extraordinary, and I think especially the north of Italy got a special perspective as regards to all of this. Anyway, happy holidays, everyone, and thank you so much for watching. See you next time on Art of the Week with Katya. See you soon.